All right, well, it is 5 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure some more people will keep trickling in, but that's okay. So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's Virtual History Happy Hour. I'm so happy to see so many familiar names and some new ones out there too. Thanks for being here with us. And for those of you who don't know me, hi, I'm Ileana. I work at the Camron-Stanford House. I'm one of the assistant directors there where I work with collections and exhibits. And now I also get to add webinar hosts to my job duties, which is a lot of fun. So pleasure to meet all of you. And before we get started, and before I hand things over to Amy, I just wanted to take a quick minute to review some of the features of our Zoom webinar. I know this might be the first time attending one of these for some of you, so I just wanted to point out a few things. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little control bar down at the bottom. It should be like a dark gray color. You'll see options for both a chat box and a Q&A box. Please feel free to use the chat box to talk to each other. You can ask questions, discuss amongst yourselves, and even just say hello if you'd like to. If you could you please open that chat box right now? There's something I want to show you. You'll see a little drop-down menu once you open the chat box. You're going to want to select all panelists and participants in that little menu. Otherwise, only myself and Amy will be able to see your messages. So if you'd like to go ahead and test that now, you're welcome to. So yeah, don't forget to change that drop-down menu. As I mentioned, you're free to ask questions in the chat. I'll be tracking all of them and relaying them to Amy at the end of the presentation. There's also that button in your control menu that says Q&A, and you're totally welcome to use that to ask questions as well. People are allowed to respond to questions if they know the answers, but again, I'll relay those questions to Amy once she's done with her presentation. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to our wonderful guest speaker for tonight. Amy O'Hearn is a historian of 19th century United States. She is currently a graduate student at UC Berkeley's PhD program in history. Amy has a particular interest in urban built environments, and she is currently working on her dissertation, which examines how drugstores functioned as social spaces in the 19th century. So Amy, thank you so much for joining us. I'll go ahead and pass all the controls over to you now. Okay. So I'll stop my share.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you to Oakland's Camron-Stanford House for organizing this event. And thank you to Ileana for inviting me to do this. And thank you to all of you listening for taking time out of your day to join me in this history happy hour. So I'm going to switch to I have a slide presentation, so I'm going to be switching to that. So let's see if that works. I think it needs to be enabled, Ileana. The share screen. There it goes. Okay, thanks. Okay, and then I will do this. Okay. Okay, so here we go. The title of my lecture is Off with the Corsets, a brief history of 19th century dress reform. I'd like to emphasize the word brief in the title. I'll only be able to cover bits and pieces of dress reform history in this lecture, so please understand that there is more to the story. To begin, I'd like to talk a bit about the illustrations on this slide. The one on the left shows a 19th century woman wearing, ta-da, a corset. I did not want to assume that everyone listening to this lecture knew what a corset was, so I wanted to show one. The word corset is the diminutive of the old French word corps, meaning body. So corset means small body. Wearing a corset indeed results in the appearance of a smaller body, since, as you can see, it shapes the torso by reducing the waist size and thereby emphasizing the bust and hips. And this results in the so-called hourglass figure. Using more than a dozen historical corsets on display at London's Victoria and Albert Museum, One scholar found that the average woman's waist size while wearing a corset was 22 inches in circumference. So compared to a recent study of modern British women's bodies, this is more than 10 inches smaller than today's average waist size. So very, when they were wearing their corsets, they had very tiny waists. The illustration on the right is from a late 19th century book titled Physiology for Young People. And this particular illustration was found under a section called Hygiene of Breathing. It shows two figures. The left one is without a corset and the right one with. As you can see, corsets pushed in the rib cage and compress the body's organs. On average, the corset applied 21 pounds of pressure to the abdominal area, and some corsets applied up to 88 pounds of pressure. So this particular book, Physiology for Young People, basically what they were doing with this illustration, it was published in 1888, and the author basically was saying that anyone who wears a corset is a fool, because how could you breathe wearing something like that? So that's the author's argument in a nutshell about corsets. Tired of corsets and other wardrobe mainstays, some women in the early decades of the 19th century began to do away with them in favor of more comfortable clothing. They first wore this less restrictive clothing in private settings. But by 1851, increasing numbers of women began wearing these outfits in public. A movement for dress reform had begun. Okay, so to better understand some of the factors that prompted the dress reform movement, it's important to understand the historical context in which it formed. So beginning around 1830, many moral reformers in the United States declared that the home should be a feminine place, sedate and private. And this was in contrast to the masculine political realm and tumultuous market society. So the top left image is emblematic of this ideology. And scholars often call this the cult of domesticity. So in other words, the idea was that the woman was to be predominantly in the home and taking care of her children. So this image was published in 1850 in a famous magazine for women. And the caption, which I included here, read, "The Sphere of Woman." So that caption, alongside the image of a mother tending to her children, aligned with the idea that a woman's place or sphere around this time was the private home, and that her role in society was mainly to raise children in a nurturing environment. A society's fashions often reflect the beliefs and values of its citizens. Keeping in mind the cult of domesticity ideology, I'd like to briefly describe how most American women dressed for much of the 19th century. Middle and upper class women in the US typically wore outfits such as the one shown prominently in the center picture. As you might imagine, these women's petite waists were made possible through the use of corsets. And in addition to the corsets, these women were expected to wear a lawn skirt with crinoline, which are basically stiffened or hooped petticoats. Crinoline weighed an average of 20 pounds, and they would usually be hooked to the corset. These fashions, they impaired women's breathing. They caused women to trip over stairs and made some physical movements difficult, if not impossible. In particular, wearing corsets could result in prolapsed uteri, broken ribs, and damaged internal organs. So I just talked a little bit about what typical middle and upper class 19th century women wore, but what about other women? Well, elaborate dresses, bonnets, and accoutrements were expensive, so very few working class women would have had the money to pay for them. Whether or not a working class woman could afford corsets and crinoline, she was expected to wear lawn skirts. For women factory workers, these skirts frequently got caught in machinery, and of course, that could be very hazardous. As for enslaved women in the United States, the vast majority of them would not have worn corsets or crinoline, although a small percentage did. For instance, some enslaved women, called fancy maids by slave traders, were often sold as concubines. They occasionally appeared, dressed elaborately, at balls and other social gatherings with their owners. So the image on the right shows a light-skinned enslaved woman standing on an auction block. Considering that she's wearing crinoline, it's almost certain that she would have been marketed and sold as a fancy maid. Despite the rather pervasive nature of the cult of domesticity, by the 1840s, some American women began to publicly challenge the notion of separate spheres, along with the corsets and crinoline that seemed to reflect women's ties to the home. And by 1851, the involvement of prominent women leaders helped to make the dress reform movement a national phenomenon. Okay, so here, the 1850s dress reform movement did not emerge out of the blue. Instead, the challenge to conventional feminine attire mostly came from three other movements of the antebellum period: the Oneida community, the health reform movement, and lastly, the women's rights movement. But what was dress reform? Well, there's really no simple answer to this question, since dress reform meant different things for different women, and we'll see this in a moment. But in basic terms, women dress reformers typically wore medium-length skirts with some sort of pants underneath, and the type of pants would vary. And again, we'll see examples of this. This clothing allowed for wider freedom of movement than conventional dress. Before 1850, pants were on the fringes of fashion for American women, and pants were found mainly at communal societies and health resorts. Also, some women who worked on farms or who lived and worked on farms wore pants, but basically, pants were not, by any means a regular appearance in society. So one of these communal societies was New York's Oneida community, and it was founded in 1848 by John Humphrey Noyes. People came to Oneida to be separated from the world, and this often meant discarding contemporary fashions. So at Oneida, women tended to wear short dresses and pantalettes, which were fashioned after little girls' lawn underpants. The pantalettes consisted of two fabric tubes that either buttoned to underwear at the knee or tied on just above the knee. Since pantalettes were considered a child's garment, it can be surmised that the women at Oneida who wore those outfits felt childlike rather than empowered. The photo on the left shows a young Oneida woman wearing the typical outfit of the community's women. And when I look at this photo, I don't know about you all, but I think maybe she's having a bad day. She does not look happy. So to me, she doesn't look empowered, but that's just my interpretation. Maybe some other people have different opinions, but yeah, I just find it hard. Well, we can get into that in the Q&A if you like, but that's a young Oneida woman. So in addition to wearing pantalettes, as you can see in the photo, many Oneida women also cut their hair short. And the idea was that they would appear more girlish. And this goes along with the leader, John Humphrey Noyes, he didn't exactly believe in the equality of the sexes, so women were usually seen as subordinate. So by having them appear childlike, that kind of went along with his, his beliefs. The health reform movement also adopted a costume for women. It was similar to the one by those worn by those in the Oneida community. The people in the health reform movement who adopted it were mostly practitioners and advocates of hydropathy. It was also known as water cure. So hydropathy was a health system that combined various forms of water therapy, such as baths, compresses, and wet sheets, with an austere diet and temperance. And hydropathists, they criticized regular medical practitioners, so regular doctors, for encouraging dependence on doctors and medicines. And hydropathists instead championed the three physicians. They called it the three physicians, water, exercise, and diet. And they preached self-help and preventative medical treatment. Hydropathists also challenged the prevailing cult of ladylike delicacy and weakness that was part of this cult of domesticity. And the hydropathists urged women to engage in physical labor and exercise in the open air. So since the short dress and accompanying loose trousers allowed women to move about more freely, it made sense for health reformers to adopt this costume, because then the women could exercise more easily than if they were wearing their corsets and long dresses. So this costume became an essential part of health cures. And it didn't take long for health reformers to call the outfit the freedom dress or freedom suit, because it allowed for freedom of movement. That was key to them and to their health regimen. So now to the women's rights movement. In 1851, key leaders of this emerging movement, so for example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they adopted and thereby politicized the reform costume. But Stanton had been introduced to it by her cousin, Elizabeth Smith Miller. And Miller, as she told the story, she was working in her garden one day, early in 1851, and she decided she had had enough of her regular clothes. And she later wrote about this momentous occasion. So I'm gonna quote Elizabeth Smith Miller. While spending many hours at work in the garden, I became so thoroughly disgusted with the lawn skirt that the dissatisfaction suddenly ripened into the decision that this shackle should no longer be endured. Turkish trousers to the ankle with a skirt reaching some 4 inches below the knee were substituted for the heavy, untidy, exasperating old garment. So those are the words of Elizabeth Smith Miller. And in this excerpt, she used the phrase Turkish trousers. So an example of what Miller meant by this is shown in the photo in the right. Both men and women from certain parts of Asia, including the Ottoman Empire, which is in modern-day Turkey, wore baggy pants. And in the Turkish language, they're called shalvar. And these gathered at the ankle over a long tunic. So once American women started wearing pants, they often dubbed them as Turkish trousers, going off of what they knew about these Ottoman Empire women wearing similar clothing. So the outfit that Miller created consisted of a medium-length skirt worn over trousers gathered at the ankles, without corsets or other confining undergarments. Shortly after she created it, Miller wore it on a visit to Seneca Falls, New York, where she stayed with her cousin, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And as Miller recalled, Stanton and her friend, Amelia Bloomer, at once, she wrote, they joined me in wearing the new costume. So many of you probably have heard about bloomers, so I'll talk just a little bit about Amelia Bloomer. She was a temperance advocate, activist, and abolitionist. By temperance, for those of you who don't know, it's basically, for the most part in the 19th century, when people said temperance, it was urging people not to drink alcohol. So she was into temperance, and she was an abolitionist, and she launched a newspaper for women, which she called The Lily, in 1848. And after she saw this costume that Elizabeth Smith Miller had created, Amelia Bloomer included an editorial in her paper praising this outfit. And after that editorial appeared, the circulation of the Lily soared, and Amelia Bloomer was inundated with requests from around the country for the pattern that Elizabeth Smith Miller had created. And after this point, many people started calling this outfit the Bloomer. Even though Amelia Bloomer didn't create it, she's credited for publicizing it. So when you hear people talk about bloomers, if you didn't know, now you know. Amelia Bloomer, she's the one who kind of like spearheaded that aspect of things. Okay. It didn't take long for the dress reform movement to show up in popular culture. These images show two examples of sheet music from the mid-19th century that incorporated aspects of dress reform into their very titles. So the one on the left is called The New Costume Polka, and the one on the right is The Bloomer Waltz. Looking at these illustrations, it seems as though the women on them may be wearing corsets. If you look at their waists, they do look pretty small. So that would be my guess, but nevertheless, as you can see, their skirts are shorter than conventional ones, and the women are wearing bloomers. So as you can see, the bloomers were usually quite billowy. So this is in contrast to the straight cut of the pantalettes of the woman from the Oneida community. So remember, the woman on the left, she's wearing these pantalettes, which are really straight cut. But most bloomers were quite, had a lot of material and looked kind of, yeah, billowy, voluminous. Okay. With their corsets and fancy garments, the women shown on this sheet music, they probably would have been considered somewhat conservative within the dress reform movement, but the mere act of wearing bloomers was rather subversive at the time. So that's something to consider. As the dress reform movement gained momentum, new journals, especially those devoted to women's rights issues, they printed articles in support of the movement. The Sibyl, published from 1856 to 1864, was one of these publications. But it was unique because it was devoted almost entirely to dress reform. Whereas other publications would have the occasional article about dress reform, the Sibyl's, that was its main goal, was to just really, I don't want to say propaganda, but almost. It was really, that was its mission. And in fact, it was an organ of the National Dress Reform Association, which had formed 2 years before the Sibyl's debut. To illustrate its stance that contemporary fashions were equated with female passivity and were therefore oppressive, the Sibyl's masthead, which is shown here, it featured a woman wearing a dress reform suit. It's apparent that this woman is not wearing a corset. I mean, at least to me, her waist size looks unaltered, let's say. and her skirt and trousers are rather plain. Compared to the two women shown on the sheet music from the previous slide, which there, this woman would probably be perceived as on the more radical side of the dress reform movement. In its first issue, the Sibyl explained the design behind its masthead, and it's here on the slide. I'm just going to read from it. So the editor wrote, "We have spared neither pains nor expense on our title head, which tells quite a story of itself. Believing the true basis of reform has been lost sight of in most of the movements of women, we have endeavored to blend our idea in our design by showing one of each sex working." So I don't know if you guys can see, I tried to make it as big as possible on this slide, but on either side of the woman in the center are illustrations of women and men working together as printers and editors. So yeah, the Sibyl was very straightforward about its goals for women's equality in the workplace and in society in general. Okay. The founder of the Sibyl was a woman named Lydia Sayer. As a young woman in the late 1840s, she was devastated when a college refused to admit her based on her habitual mode of dress, which was an adaptation of Turkish trousers with a shortened skirt, as shown here. In Lydia Sayer's own words, "As I left, I fairly bathed my soul in an agony of tears and silent prayers. I registered a vow that I would stand or fall in the battle for women's physical, political, and educational freedom and equality." So that's what she wrote when she realized that the school would not admit her. She was really, really crushed by that decision of the school. But you know, it motivated her. So around 1853, Lydia studied hydropathy at the Hygieia Therapeutic College in New York, and it was one of the first medical schools in the United States to admit women. She received her medical degree from there. And in 1856, as you know, she founded the Sibyl, and shortly after, she married her publisher, John Hasbrouck. And Lydia's only concession to traditional bridal garb was that her customary bloomer costume was white. So picture, you know, this is Lydia on the Sibyl's masthead. Just picture her in white, and that's basically what she wore when she got married. It's pretty cool. Okay, so moving on. Despite the benevolent depictions of bloomers on sheet music and the support for the dress reform movement found in publications like the Sibyl, the general public reacted to dress reformers with disdain or even hostility. The trouser component of the dress reform costume was what most enraged critics. Numerous articles appeared in the Sibyl chronicling the harassment of women who appeared in public wearing bloomers. So the harassment ranged from stares to whistles, catcalls, and sometimes just laughter. But sometimes the criticism took physical form. So there was one woman in New York City, for example, she was a dress reformer, and she was followed for several blocks, and she was pelted with stones and mud. And many women wrote to the Sibyl, and they said, well, we really want to wear the reform costume, but we're afraid to appear in public doing so. So the Sibyl really served as a forum for women to talk about their experiences wearing bloomers or wearing what freedom suits or whatever they happen to call it. But yeah, most women at some time or another would have had some pushback for choosing to wear those outfits. Women who engaged in dress reform, they were seen as challenging normative ideas about gender and sexuality. So take Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's pictured here on the upper left, and she's wearing bloomers in this, this illustration. In 1851, her husband, Henry B. Stanton, was running for election to the New York Senate. And while he was doing so, voters told him repeatedly that they would not elect a man whose wife wore bloomers. And on election day, New Yorkers shouted the taunt, which is here on the slide, "Hey, ho, the carrion crow, Mrs. Stanton's all the go. 20 tailors take the stitches, Mrs. Stanton wears the breeches." So breeches being pants, basically. So despite these public challenges to his masculinity, Henry B. Stanton supported his wife's decision to wear dress reform attire. And he did win the election, but only by a narrow margin. The two photos on the bottom right of this slide are of Dr. Mary Walker. She grew up in rural New York, and she had 6 siblings, and she lived and worked on her family's farm. And Mary Walker's parents were free thinkers. So basically, they subscribed to the idea that there was no quote-unquote women's work, and there was no quote-unquote men's work. So Mary grew up doing all sorts of tasks on the farm. And her parents actually encouraged Mary and her sisters to wear outfits like bloomers. And Mary called it the American costume. So basically, the picture of her on the left is what she would call the American costume. I mean, it's very similar to what Elizabeth Cady Stanton is wearing. And presumably this photo of Mary Walker is taken when she was probably at school, not working on the farm, but nonetheless, her farm work outfit was probably pretty similar. So Mary Walker, though, as you can see, the right photo is also of her. And over time, but this photo was taken probably 2 decades after the one on the left. So her attire became increasingly what, according to the people in the 19th century, would say masculine. By age 23, she'd become a medical doctor. And like many medical doctors in her day, she promoted clothing in which women could move freely. So like I talked about the hydropathists, she was very much aligned with that idea. And besides the need to have freedom of movement, another reason that Mary Walker used for women to that they could use to justify their switch to shorter skirts was that the longer skirts just spread dirt everywhere. And as I said before, they could be, women frequently tripped on them. So there were all sorts of reasons to make the switch. So yes, by the 1870s, Walker had taken to wearing men's clothing, kind of like in the photo on the right. So sometimes she even wore a top hat. She had a bow tie, and even her pants and shoes were I think she would even buy them from men's clothing stores. And she was actually arrested several times for impersonating a man. And she was proud of this, though. And what I want to point out is that Mary Walker, she wasn't a typical dress reformer. Most dress reformers didn't dress quite to this extreme, you might say, but she wasn't an anomaly. For example, there was a woman in San Francisco, Eliza Hurd de Wolf, and in 1866, she was arrested for violating San Francisco's ordinance that forbid women to appear in public in male attire. But in reality, Eliza was just wearing bloomers. But bloomers in some cities, such as San Francisco, were enough to cause genuine riots. Maybe I'm using that word a little too freely here, but considering recent events, but somewhat large crowds of people would congregate around these women and shouting and screaming at them. And this one was considered a disruption. So Eliza was arrested, and like most women back in the 19th century, she couldn't actually testify on her own behalf. Her husband testified for her. And basically, he pointed out to the judge that Eliza's clothing was very similar to most women's clothing, except the skirt was just a little bit shorter and she wore bloomers. But the judge ruled against Eliza because he pointed out how her clothing was enough to start this mob. So Eliza had to return to long skirts. A preoccupation with women who decided to wear pants was prominent in mainstream press coverage of women's reform issues. So some editors referred to dress reformers as, quote, Amazons of the New World, or as a hybrid species, half man, half woman. In departing from the prevailing fashion of lawn skirts and tight corsets, dress reformers were seen as repudiating and undermining the traditional values of home and family that many women use to define themselves. Okay. So in addition to writing negative articles about dress reformers, the mainstream press also printed cartoons lambasting them. The term bloomerism came to be inevitably, if incorrectly, associated not just with wearing trousers, but also with other supposedly deviant behaviors. Deviant, at least for women. And these behaviors included smoking, drinking, and gambling. Cartoons like this one from 1851 depict women engaging in some of these behaviors while wearing bloomers and skirts. However, I want to point out that the skirts shown here were intentionally drawn shorter than those worn by dress reformers to further ridicule them. The women in this cartoon, and many others like it, through their posture, activity, and attire, seem to show a disdain for all the conventions of femininity. So as you can see, a couple of the women here are even sporting top hats, somewhat like Dr. Mary Walker occasionally wore a top hat, and these women are as well. So critics of the bloomer costume, they would decry the so-called unsexing of women, because after all, women weren't supposed to smoke cigars or gamble or wear these top hats. So there's this real anxiety with the critics of the dress reformers. The reform dress became a symbol of everything that was threatening about feminism. Women shaping their lives in accordance with their own needs, women declaring independence from male approval, and women doing or wearing what had been traditionally reserved for men. So the previous cartoon depicted a dystopia of sorts that showing the dress reformers congregating in public. But in contrast to that scenario, this 1852 cartoon shows a dress reformer in a domestic setting. Here, a woman in a bloomer costume scolds her husband, telling him to put down your novel and do something rational. So novels had become extremely popular in the early decades of the 19th century, especially amongst women. But many Americans feared that women were particularly susceptible to the fantasies they found in novels and to the seductions of reading. So in other words, when women became immersed in a novel, they were seen as likely to neglect their domestic duties. So returning to the image, if you can see, the woman's posture is very assertive as are her words. So this makes it clear that she is dominant in this scene. And furthermore, by showing a man reading a novel and a woman criticizing him for doing so, this artist is illustrating the disruption, the perceived disruption in the cult of domesticity. So here it's the woman who wears the pants, so to speak, while the man is sedate. In part because of the pervasive harassment they were subject to when they usually appeared in public wearing dress reform outfits, most women's rights leaders began to reason that more basic changes were needed before women could successfully challenge the conventional notions of beauty. However, they were not in complete agreement about which change was the most crucial. So many of you probably have heard of Susan B. Anthony, and it's probably not surprising that for her, the most crucial change was the vote. So Susan B. Anthony argued that once women had the ballot, they could be able to define themselves and their clothing. On the other hand, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, what she argued was the most critical change was the need to change the institutions and beliefs that perpetuated marriage and maternity as the sole objects of women's lives. And then lastly, or second to lastly, Amelia Bloomer, for her, the most critical change was the need to have quality higher education for women. Basically, Amelia Bloomer thought that some higher education for women did exist at this time, but in Bloomer's opinion, a lot of it was superficial, and she really wanted women's colleges and to offer the same curriculum as that men's colleges would. And once she felt that once women could be educated in this way, they could feel the need and understand the benefits of dress reform. So despite the different views of these women, it seems as though most of the leaders of the women's rights movement agreed with Lucy Stone. So she's pictured on this slide. Lucy Stone was a famous abolitionist and suffragist, and she wrote that women's miserable style of dress is a consequence of her present vassalage, not its cause. In other words, Lucy Stone and others espouse the view that social and political institutions would have to be changed before most women would challenge prevailing standards of femininity for the sake of health and freedom. And by the late 1850s, most women's rights leaders largely strove to conform to fashion rather than upend it. And these leaders, they rebranded themselves as respectable women instead of radicals. So instead of inviting unflattering comparisons to men, suffragists and other women's rights leaders now strove to look as feminine and thus as harmless as possible. Not all women leaders abandoned dress reform, though. Harriet Tubman, for instance, well known for her work as an abolitionist, wrote about her determination to procure a pair of bloomers for her expeditions as a Union spy during the Civil War. In June 1863, at the height of the war, Tubman played a major role in the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina. During this raid, over 100 free Black soldiers on 3 gunboats liberated more than 700 slaves. And Harriet Tubman wrote about the experience later, and these are her words. Coming on board the boat, I was carrying 2 pigs for a poor sick woman who had a child to carry, and the order double quick was given. I started to run, stepped on my dress, it being rather long, and fell and tore it almost off. so that when I got on board the boat, there was hardly anything left of it but shreds. I made up my mind then I would never wear a lawn dress on another expedition, but would have a bloomer as soon as I could get it. So unfortunately, I could not find a photo of Harriet Tubman in bloomers. So I would love it if anyone somehow miraculously had one, but I thought to myself, when Tubman was wearing the bloomers, she was probably too busy to pose for a photo. So so there you have it. That's my guess anyway. But yes, Harriet Tubman continued to wear bloomers at least, you know, once in a while into the 1860s, unlike many of the women's rights leaders. Okay. Although I've mentioned some famous 19th century women who followed the dress reform tenets, at least for a while, the typical woman who wore pants in the 19th century was not a feminist. Rather, she wore them for practical reasons. For example, when I spoke of Mary Walker, when she was young, living and working on her parents' farm, that's the type of woman that usually wore pants in the 19th century. But however, when famous women leaders stopped wearing bloomers in public, then the dress reform movement lost its momentum. As I mentioned before, the Sibyl stopped publication in 1864, and the National Dress Reform Association dissolved the following year. So from the 1870s until the late 1880s, the only women who really wore bloomers did so for practical reasons, or because they were true radicals, like Dr. Mary Walker. Bloomers did make a comeback, though, from the late 1880s until shortly after 1900, when a bicycle craze swept through the United States. Both men and women began to spend much of their leisure time cycling. For men, riding a bike was not an inconvenience as far as clothing was concerned. But early on, women found out that lawn skirts and bicycle spokes were a recipe for disaster. Bicycle companies responded to this dilemma quickly and began to manufacture bikes with skirt guards. So on this slide, there's an advertisement for a bicycle with a skirt guard. But for many women, riding bikes meant a return to bloomers. Or they would also wear divided skirts, which is depicted in the image on the left. Nonetheless, once the bicycle frenzy passed around the year 1903, when automobiles began to become the preferred mode of travel for middle and upper class Americans, bloomers virtually disappeared from public, and they retreated to college gymnasiums. For decades, the women who rode bicycles in the United States wore skirts when doing so. Although the cycling costume has received a good amount of attention from scholars, the costume did not last long, and also it didn't greatly influence other types of dress. So it's kind of interesting to think about how the fate of the bicycle bloomer was basically the same as the fate of the dress reform costume worn by many women in the 1850s and the 1860s. For decades into the 20th century, when women were outdoors in the company of men, they wore skirts. 19th century dress reformers attacked fashions such as corsets and crinoline for warping women's health and self-image. Today, the issues the dress reformers grappled with over a century ago have increased resonance. Dress reformers enacted a battle against the corset. They insisted that a slender waist was not worth personal discomfort, and a beauty norm must not be prioritized over women's health. While the 21st century struggles with a repressive beauty norm take a different form than those of the 19th century, a look at the pitfalls and rewards of an attack on fashion could help feminists to help steer them in the right direction in debates over women's appearances. And that's my conclusion. So I'm gonna, let's see, try to stop share. And there.
All right, well,
Yay.
thank you so much, Amy. We do have a couple questions. As we're going through the questions, if anyone else has any questions they'd like to ask, please type them into the chat box or the Q&A box, and I'll get those over. But just to get us started, there is some chatter in our little chat box. Elizabeth has asked, how have you accounted for the bias that resulted in writing of the first book that you mentioned, The Physiology of the Young, in your understanding of the material?
How have I accounted for the bias in my understanding of the material? Okay. Well, that book, that was published in 1888. So that was when, it's kind of interesting to think about the timing of that, because it was part of this kind of second wave of dress reform. So in other words, after the 1860s, bloomers really weren't worn by many women. But by 1888, with bicycles becoming more and more popular, they were. So I didn't look at that many primary sources like that book that had similar arguments. But it wouldn't surprise me if there were more, because by that time, I mean, yes, it is a rather extreme bias, because they literally called women who wore corsets foolish. But on the other hand, and I didn't mention this in my lecture, corsets also began to be a little less restrictive by that time. So, so yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying to think about other sources I might have come across. But yeah, corsets had begun to change by the late 19th century. But yeah, most of this lecture, I tended to talk more about the middle of the century. So to be honest, I didn't spend that as much time researching the late 19th century, which is kind of funny because that's usually what I research. But so yeah, hopefully, Elizabeth, that somewhat answers your question. But
yeah, I think that sounds good to me. She also noted for you that the V&A acknowledges that the small measurements of corsets in their collection are the result of survival bias. That means the small corsets are the only ones that have survived, and the ones that have been donated to the museum. Do you have any comments on that concept?
Not off the top of my head, no. Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, Georgia also had a question. She would like to know if the use of corsets originated in England.
Oh gosh, I was really, in preparing this lecture, I mean, I could give a whole lecture on corsets, of course, but they do date back centuries to like the 13th century. But as far as where they originated, England would be a good guess. Either there or France would be my guesses, but I can't say for sure. But they do date back centuries. So some form of corsets. I mean, they varied over time, of course. And arguably the ones in the late 18th and up to the middle 19th century were probably among the most extreme corsets. So yeah, getting back to Elizabeth's question and just thinking about bias in general. I mean, there are so many different types of corsets. So just, yeah, I didn't get into that much, but maybe if I were to do another lecture, I would do a whole other presentation just on corsets, or expand my presentation.
Okay, great. So Nicole, she said, thank you for a great presentation, and would like to know if in your research, did you come across any sources that express concern over women riding bicycles and or wearing their bicycle riding outfits?
Yes, I did. There were even magazines specifically for bicycle riders by the end of the 19th century. and they frequently had had advertisements for outfits that would make it easier for women to ride bicycles. So definitely they by by the end of the 19th century, there was definitely more acceptance of women exercising in public. Whereas when I talked about hydropathy, that kind of started around the 1840s, 1850s, then for women to exercise, it was encouraged, especially by hydropathists, but not necessarily for them to do so in public. Whereas with bicycles, yes, it was definitely more public, and there was more press attention to the need for women to be dressed appropriately to wear to ride those bicycles. So, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Nicole.
And I think we have one last question from Andra. What about fabric material? Was there a trend in textiles in regards to bloomer materials?
Oh gosh. Once again, so I'm not a fashion historian, and I know that people have written about this extensively, and I came across this, but oh gosh, I feel bad for you guys. I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't want to venture saying, but what about you, Ileana? Do you have any?
You know,
Yeah.
I am also not a fashion historian, and I am okay with saying I don't know. But Andra, if you would like me to help you find out, you can feel free to email me, and I'm happy to point you in the direction of people who would definitely know that. But I know in terms of undergarments, a lot of times they were cotton materials, a lot of silks. But yeah, I can definitely find a person to answer that if you would like.
Well, originally I was going to do this lecture in person, and Ileana had had started to look for samples for me to use. But since the shelter in place started, obviously things have changed drastically. So I haven't gotten my hands on a real 19th century pair of bloomers. So, but yeah, I would agree with Ileana that most likely they'd be cotton. So.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. So before we go, I just want to thank Amy for the fabulous presentation. It was really fun and interesting for me. So I hope everyone that attended had a great time as well. I'm also looking forward to hearing about how your dissertation goes. Sounds like a very interesting topic. And for all of our attendees tonight, Amy has graciously allowed us to record tonight's lecture. So in the next few days, you'll receive a link about how to access the recording. And I'd also like to mention that we have a few more events in our virtual history happy hour series coming up. The next one is July 16th, where historian Sarah Gold McBride will be talking to us about freak shows and their place in American popular culture. And the following week, which is, I believe, the 23rd, we'll have Dan Real, who is the co-founder of Catalog It, which is the cataloging software we use in our museum. And he's going to be sharing his best tips for preserving your family's history and how you too can become a proper family historian. So if you're interested in any of those events, feel free to register. They're all free. You can do that at www.cshouse.org/events. And finally, an immense thank you to all of you for continuing to support our work at the Camron-Stanford House. We rely on the support of our community to make all of our programs and preservation work happen. So if you're able to, please consider donating or if you're able to consider donating to the Camron-Stanford House website, or perhaps purchasing a membership to show your support, you can also do that at our website at cshouse.org. So thank you all for coming and staying here with us for the evening. Have a safe and happy 4th of July. Yeah, good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Bye, Ileana.
Bye.
Bye.